Today on Reaction, we're talking about the Labour Party, which is holding its conference in Brighton at the moment, and asking the question, is Labour, Britain's opposition, is it making any progress? Alastair Benn, Deputy Editor of Reaction, joining me. What do you make of it? Is Labour making any progress so far?
I think it's making some progress in the sense that in Rachel Reeves, I think they've found someone who, uh, in the cliched phrase, can speak human. Like you listen to her speak about economics, and it's made real in a way that I think Annalise Dodds didn't capture the imagination. So I think they found someone who's a good communicator, but also can actually communicate economic kind of tensions within economics quite well. Um, so I think that is clearly progress to find a shadow chancellor who is. I don't know your thoughts on her, but I just think every media appearance she makes, I think on the economic stuff at any rate, she sounds plausible. So there's that. I think I can see what they're trying to do on a couple of things, which are sort of understandable. So taking the kind of the aftermath of the pandemic in terms of people's assumptions about the role of the states and about the kind of the potential, the good that the state can do in the economy and shaping the economy and all that territory, they've sort of understood that a way of potential political opening there is saying, well, Labour might be better at managing that state than the Tories. Yeah. So less sleazy. Starmer has an obvious kind of personal history there in terms of having run a kind of big corporate organisation, a complex organisation.
Yeah.
So I think he probably feels justified in making the case that he might be better at that than Boris. And I think, but the problem with that story is that I think a lot of it is inflected, unfortunately, by what Keir gets up to read in The Guardian every day, which is all about Tory sleaze and dodgy contracts.
Yeah.
And the Tories being fundamentally unserious. And, I know that both of us are not, huge fans of Boris's leadership style, but there's only so far you can get with criticisms which focus just on kind of Boris being, but Boris's personal flaws, as egregious as they are.
Yeah, this is the idea, Alistair, that the next election can be won on the question of integrity, and that somehow that saying that Boris Johnson is, as you describe, and making that claim, that people will be so outraged that will then sort of turf the Tories out of government. I suppose there's a bit of a parallel with Tory sleaze and what happened in the 1990s. But also, the thing that really did for the Tories preceded that, which was the economic impact of the chaos of Black Wednesday and Britain crashing out of the ERM. That's the moment it really turned for the Tories, and people just concluded that they were not competent when it came to the question of economic management. So sleaze was on top of that, and it was just cumulative. The Tories had been in for a very long time and were very tired. I suppose what grabs me about the Labour conference is that I think he is on one level, Starmer is making more progress than people are giving him credit for in terms of defining himself or doing the work in opposition to try and sort of shift his party. And people say, well, wasn't the start of conference a complete shambles? Well, the start of conference under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown was very often portrayed as a complete shambles. There's a long tradition in the Labour Party. It's a democratic party in a way that the Conservative Party isn't, sort of directly democratic, with more of a say for the membership. And what that means is that people come to conference after the summer, after September, and they're political people, political activists, fired up, annoyed about not being listened to, wanting to make their point. And that usually results in all sorts of rows on the Saturday and the Sunday around rule changes or conference procedure. And then things sort of level out. You get some of the key speeches. In Gordon Brown and Tony Blair's day, it was always Gordon Brown set himself up as the leader in waiting with the Chancellor's speech, and then Blair followed in those days, I think, on the Tuesday with the barnstorming speech, which reasserted his authority. So there's an arc and a history to it. So I think people expecting it to be some like kind of slick, managed thing on the Saturday and the Sunday are just possibly kind of unfamiliar with Labour history or forgetting. So I think he's won some significant victories on the rule changes. He's pretty much got through what he wanted, not the Electoral College, but changes which will theoretically make it more difficult for the far left to take over the party. Again, I suppose that on the downside, and John Harris of The Guardian has been good on this and has tweeted about just how irrelevant a lot of it looks. I mean, this is a government which should be in quite serious trouble on rising prices, stresses in the economy, shortages, fuel shortages. I mean, they're nothing like the 70s, but there's material there that a really coherent opposition, that a Blair and Brown could do something with to do real damage, and that doesn't seem to be happening yet. But the irrelevance point is that 10 o'clock news was dominated, or the Labour end of the 10 o'clock news was dominated by the resignation of Andy MacDonald, who most people will never have heard of. I'm a political obsessive, so I've heard of him, but he's not a massive figure. But his walking out the shadow cabinet was presented as this, which actually I think is good for Starmer because it's a Corbynite leaving, and it just looked all the anger and the silly rallies from the far left who don't take who are not prepared to accept that Corbynism failed and now they want another go, and just the intensity of their delusion broadcast to the nation, just all of that together just made them look a long way from power. And there was a striking moment where it was mentioned on the 10 o'clock news just how many seats there are. I think it's more than 100 seats they need to get a majority of one, and they're so far from what you might think of when I say centre ground, I don't mean ideologically, I just mean mainstream, sort of straight down the middle Britain, which doesn't think too much about politics all the time, but at some point will be in the market for an alternative government. And they just look, it just looks a bit insipid, and it certainly doesn't look like a government in waiting. Am I being unfair?
I think I think the anti-McDonald thing was damaging on that kind of PR level. But I think what they maybe will be frustrated about on a deeper level. And again, I don't know what the plan was with Rachel Reeves' conference speech, but every newspaper this morning has responded with the greenest chancellor in waiting ever. Now, and splashing on the big headline, spending I think 28 billion on the environment every year, and all well and good. I mean, but the problem is there is a time and a place to really go on these issues, and it's not when the government are also spending huge amounts on this stuff, and it's not right in the middle of a massive, a crisis of confidence in the energy markets, and in these kind of, I just think maybe they will be frustrated with how that played out, because there was some stuff in that speech about kind of the rising cost of living and those issues, which is what they should be more disciplined about.
Yeah.
And I think it's that what I've been thinking about in the last couple of days is that problem of discipline, and they're just not disciplined with how they talk about the economy. And I think that is actually the fundamental problem. People are really looking for another answer on the rising cost of living, inflationary pressures, the pay packet being squeezed, all these kind of really essential, issues. I just don't think Labour are cutting through.
I think it was so. Starmer would say that that's what the performative part of his opposition to, or refusal to commit to, a £15 minimum wage in the UK, which of course is the far left reading right across from the US, where AOC, etc., the $15 minimum wage is the great cry. So it is a far left demand. So he's in that sense he would say, well, he is being responsible, because he's saying, as various front benchers have said, you can't set it this far out from an election. He has an aspiration for higher wages, but not yet. On the greenery, I think 2 points is that is, I think, is defensible in one sense. You can understand it strategically or tactically, because they're worried about leaking votes to the Greens and leaking votes to the Lib Dems. You couldn't describe the Lib Dems yet as resurgent, but it wouldn't take that much. 3-4 points onto the Lib Dem total, a couple of points on the Green total, to do all sorts of damage in certain marginal seats where Labour need a clear run at trying to take out the Tories. So I think that's signalling to a certain kind of metropolitan. Well, I was going to say metropolitan. Some of it, they're not all metropolitan seats, but a liberal Green Britain that the Labour Party takes their concerns seriously. I suppose the thing that troubles me about it, though, from the standpoint of someone who's worried about the shape of the economy in the next 10 years, and I've been thinking a lot in the last few weeks about what the political class gets wrong, or the story of the last 20-25 years. I'm not absolving myself from it as a journalist. There's plenty of stuff I've got wrong in the last 25 years. But if you think on so many of the big challenges, stuff that's coming home to roost now, like resilience on energy supply, or understanding of the post 9/11 world and the correct response that was needed, and what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq, the management of central banks and money supply, financial regulation, on all sorts of areas. I mean, we're human, we're fallen. I'm not saying that I have any sort of perfect view of this, but it is a story in an era of transformative technological change, the last 25, 30 years, where political classes have built policy on, quite often, on big assumptions about the direction of travel that turn out then to be wrong. And that's increasingly how I'm seeing the context of COP26, in that I'm all for conservation. I can see the logic of decarbonising the economy, but at the speed it's being proposed and the expense that's being proposed, and the political class, both major parties, or all major parties, are completely convinced that this is the right way to go, and that nothing can possibly go wrong in terms of energy security, the shape of the economy, growth. After the last 25 years, that makes me worried and yearn for a more realistic, reflective conversation about climate. So I think that's another thing which may end up sort of blowing up in the face of the political class. What about Starmer himself? He does. Someone described him the other day as a ghost. That you just can't. And it's not even like William Hague, who had trouble communicating his real personality to the public. It's more than that. He just doesn't seem, to me, like a leader. Am I being harsh?
The two things that I find odd about Starmer is, one, that, I mean, the bar, and he became a QC very young. The bar itself is a very political world. It's tough to do what he did. You have to be good at thinking strategically. You have to be ruthless. So it's not as if he hasn't concrete experience of the kind of, the greasy pole of political life and understand. But as a leader, he leaves a lot to be desired. And, I think I've written about this before, in that kind of mode that journalists often have, which is trying to work out the real Keir Starmer and saying, well, there's actually a real Keir Starmer behind the real Keir Starmer, who's much more closely matched to your own assumptions about what Keir Starmer should be about. Yeah. And he's not my Keir Starmer that I thought could be a decent shot. But he's not really shaping into anything else, and that's what's troubling me. He's just, I think, slightly stuck. And I think the problem there is, everyone titters about his sort of big long pamphlets monograph thing, and reading it, and I'm going to confess I didn't read the whole thing because it was so turgid, and I'm a big believer in, if you're really struggling with something and you can't read it, just stop reading it. There's no point. Yeah. And I got a third of the way through it, and I just thought, well, you can write 10, 15,000 words of rubbish in under 2 hours, and all fluff. And that's what it was. And I think there isn't enough intellectual curiosity in his circle, maybe around him. There isn't enough, kind of, it just makes you yearn for an era of Labour politicians, even for all his flaws, someone like Michael Foot, who could marry the kind of pragmatic and visionary elements of the Labour mission in great speeches, or just a bit of wits and a bit of humour. And he just doesn't. I think a lot of his politics is obviously rooted in this kind of liberal human rights world, which is a very, it's not a very visionary kind of politics. It's kind of
it's pretty
limited by its assumptions. And I just think
it's pretty earnest and off-putting. Listen, on that point, I think we'll wrap it up there for the moment, though. Alastair will talk more maybe after Keir Starmer's speech. Let's see if it's worthy of discussion. But you're watching Reaction. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, hit the subscribe button below, and also please like this video. And also go below to visit the site where the address is there, and you can become a subscriber to Reaction and get my weekly newsletter and all the work that the team does. But until next time, thank you for joining us.